I want to go through a short tutorial on complex numbers. I'm certainly no mathematician, but in the language of quantum mechanics, we need to know a little bit about complex numbers, which some of you may have learned about in previous mathematics courses. And I will try to walk us through some of the key elements that I thought were important after thinking about all the lectures we had to go through in our quantum mechanics coming up. So let me try to go through some of the key points here. Mostly we're used to dealing with so-called real numbers, numbers which we can represent along a number line. But real numbers have a certain restriction to them. There are some things that can't be represented by a real number. For example, the famous example is the square root of a negative number. There's no such definition for that amongst the real numbers. And thus it was invented the idea of a so-called imaginary number, which is defined as the square root of -1, and it's called I. Of course, it's not really any more imaginary than any of the other numbers. It's just that we give it the name imaginary to make sure that we don't confuse it with the real numbers and can set it apart as something different. So with this concept of I, we're going to be able to solve algebraic expressions which the real numbers can't help us with. For example, things like this are not computable within the real numbers for real numbers x, which have absolute values less than 2. But it will be solvable amongst numbers that involve this thing called I. So we define another kind of number called a complex number. Which in general can have a real and imaginary part. So a complex number is usually denoted by z, and it has a real part x and an imaginary part y. X is sometimes denoted as the real of z, y is the imaginary part of z, which is sometimes denoted like this. Now it has to be pointed out that complex numbers cannot be represented along a number line like the real numbers can. Instead, one needs a two-dimensional graph. The vertical axis in this graph represents the imaginary part. The horizontal axis in this graph represents the real part. So in general, a complex number is sitting out here as a point in this two-dimensional graph represented by this ordinate pair x, y.